Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. This episode of the New Stack Makers is brought to you by Twistlock, the complete cloud-native security platform protecting containers, serverless, and Kubernetes applications against threats. Twistlock is the only cloud-native security platform to provide real-time threat intelligence and management through the application development lifecycle across every cloud-native environment. Hey, it's Alex Williams, founder and editor-in-chief of the New Stack, here at CooperCon, getting things started with a discussion with Shannon, my good friend Shannon Williams, co-founder of Rancher Labs. How are you?
I'm great, Alex. Good to be back in Seattle.
Here we are. And so we're here for the CooperCon show, and I think there's about 8,000 people here, but one of the big topics already being discussed is the security issue. And I would love to just kind of get your take on things, on this vulnerability that we just saw last week. And I know you were a big part of like the team that was, looking at this vulnerability and trying to understand its root cause and everything else. Can you talk to us a little bit about the vulnerability itself?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the vulnerability came out. It's kind of a long story. My co-founder Darren Shepard saw some unusual behavior. Gosh, going back about a couple years ago, he blogged about this last week, and when we first saw it, it was actually some unusual behavior in an early version, like a 1.6, 1.5 version of Rancher. We had customers trying to use Amazon's ALB load balancer, and we were seeing some unusual, drop packets and things, and we weren't quite sure what was going on, and so. We thought it was just down to ALB being brand new and being a bug in ALB, and sort of told people don't use ALB, use ELB, and all the behavior was normal. And so it was kind of on the back burner, something we weren't paying attention to. And then maybe 2 months ago, all of a sudden it resurfaced, and we saw it again with Rancher 2.0 on Kubernetes. And as we saw it, we were like, that bug shouldn't still be there with ALB. ALB is pretty stable now. And so we looked into it a little bit deeper and found there was actually, a potential exploit where people could, escalate their privileges using, and I'm the worst one to describe it all, but using some the way proxies handled some tunneling aspects of how users accessed services running in Kubernetes. It was a pretty low risk vulnerability in the sense of it was very likely that there were other protections in place that would protect you from getting to it. Mm-hmm. But overall, the experience for us was really amazing, working with the rest of the Kubernetes community to identify it, get it pushed out, get patches pushed to everyone, and things worked the way they were supposed to. Right? We identified it. It was kind of kept quiet until the fixes were pushed out, and then everyone had the ability to patch really quickly last week.
So the packets were being dropped. And what is it when you first see something like a packet's being dropped? What are some of the first kind of the first round of checks that you make, and to determine what it is exactly? I'm curious about that because drop packets could be anything, right?
Yeah, it wasn't so much, as I understand it, wasn't so much that there were packets dropped. It was that something with the SSL tunnel was not getting established correctly. And so there was something going on there. And Darren goes into a lot of depth on it. I don't really understand it all. He walked me through it twice, and I'm like, okay, it's clearly over my technical head. But as I understood it, the risk was that by using this exploit, you could take your privilege and escalate it to an admin. And again, most people were protected because typically load balancers kind of ensure that the kind of traffic that would go through to make this happen couldn't get through, and the exploit couldn't be consumed. But it was there, and for anyone who was using it without that kind of a load balancer in front of it, there was definitely a risk.
So there's so much interest in Kubernetes, obviously, and there's so much interest in using it. How did you think about bringing this to the attention of the CNCF and the community. And tell me a little bit about how, what you did and what was the steps you took.
Yeah, I mean, the community has a really well-defined process. So there's a very explicit process for how to notify them of any kind of potential security vulnerability. Once that's notified,
Like, what is it? Like, I'm curious. I'm just very
the way I understand it is it's there's an email notification that you put in,
Right.
and you kind of notify, and it goes to a group of maintainers, and those
Okay.
maintainers are made aware of the issue, and then a small group is sort of set to go resolve this issue and
okay.
to actually build a patch, and then validate that there is a vulnerability, build a patch to resolve the vulnerability, and then notify the world after the fact. So notify the world, hey, here's a new patch, apply this, it's fixing a vulnerability, you need to apply this, or potentially you're at risk. And it's pretty typical, right? This isn't different from Linux. I mean,
Right.
it's not different from Apache. It's not
Right.
different from any other open source project where, the community identifies a vulnerability, and assuming that it's identified by someone non-malicious, it's going to be sort of escalated through the process.
And so once that happened, how did the community respond?
Oh, it was great. I mean, what we saw was, everyone took it incredibly seriously. A number of engineers worked on resolving it, and the notice was done, very effectively to everyone once there is a patch available to put it. We had put in place, when we discovered it, we put in place some stuff in Rancher to prevent it anyways, to make sure that it was prevented. And so, our customers were already protected from it, but we then, as soon as the patch was out, we gave them a really simple mechanism to upgrade their deployments. So, they just had to go roll an upgrade, and they were on the latest version of Kubernetes.
What was the retrospective that you did internally at Rancher?
We, I think from our side, I think what it points out to is, these security vulnerabilities, finding them it's very hard to set out to find them. You don't start saying, okay, sure, we all do pen testing, and we all look at potentially obvious places, the standard places where vulnerabilities could exist. But I think the thing we said is if we do see this unusual type behavior, maybe that's a good reason for us to look at security stuff. But it's hard. I mean, you're using these products, and so many tools integrated together to deliver an application that any unexpected behavior could have so many different root causes. And sometimes when you're dealing with something new like ALB at the time when we saw this, it's really easy to write it down to just, it seems like this product's still kind of coming together. It's got a lot of bugs.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if it. In retrospect, it was something where we could have identified this potentially earlier if we had someone go and kind of really investigate this from a security perspective. It was certainly not a normal place you'd expect to see this kind of thing, and it didn't trigger in anyone's brain until we saw it again, and we're like, oh, that's odd. That should have been. We would have thought that would have been resolved as ALB matured. So yeah, it's an interesting case of just reminding that you have to always be looking for these things and always be hunting for them. And as soon as that you get that weird feeling that something's not right, you dive in deeper.
Was there did you guys find any hacking that had been done at all?
We would never know. I mean, it's not the kind of thing we would know.
Yeah.
You couldn't know without knowing everyone's Kubernetes cluster out there in the world.
Right.
Though I would say it's a pretty unlikely one. It's pretty
It's just a
unlikely given
vulnerability,
how
yeah.
many people use Kubernetes that no one else discovered this. It's it's protected in a lot of other ways because it's more of a vulnerability. But it's pretty amazing. It's the first CVE. I mean, I think that's the reason it's gotten so much attention, not because of its severity necessarily. I mean, but more because it's just the first one.
Yeah. What does it mean that it's the first one for you?
I mean, I think it's a good sign that that the work going in, the Linux Foundation has invested in penetration testing. Companies working on it. There is bug bounties around already out there on Kubernetes. There's a lot going on in the community to try and keep this thing secure. And I think open source has consistently been, by far the most secure way of providing software to the world, and we're still seeing that.
What does it say about the Kubernetes core in this direction?
I don't know if it says anything. I mean, I think it's
Or
really,
what is it? Or what does it put on the roadmap in terms of what?
Look, we're in a place where Kubernetes, as its adoption has scaled, is running really, really critical workloads for a lot of organizations. I mean, I've talked to people who are running, huge media sites, running enormous banking systems, running, space systems. I mean, just about anything you can imagine now, we've got people doing it. So, I don't. Security's been important from the beginning. Companies like Twistlock pioneered, how to secure containers. Aqua, others have kind of invested in this. There are good companies who are putting a lot of energy into, building container-specific security solutions. And I know for our customers, they are choosing to use that technology to add additional security to their implementation. At the same time, at the platform level, this is something we're constantly investing in, both from a policy perspective. So a lot of the work right now is as much about leveraging the security functionality that's available and in Kubernetes itself, as it is about, kind of continuing to improve it. So many people we talk to, they have things like pod security policies that exist in Kubernetes, but they don't use them. They are using, sometimes, very often Kubernetes is implemented and not really even put behind access control. And so the strength is there in the product. I mean, access control policies, pod security policies give you an enormous amount of control over what can run. Networks are, can be very easily isolated. There's a lot of capability. So much of what we're doing at Rancher is how do you make these things easier to use? So one of the things we find all the time is, we've entered this world where Kubernetes is not one big Kubernetes cluster. I think there was a vision at some point that this would be like the cloud. You'd run one big one of these and everyone would access that same cluster. At least in our customer base, we're in a multi-cluster world. Everyone's running, implementations of Kubernetes in different availability zones, different data centers, for different projects, for different teams, for production, for staging. I mean, it's a multi-Kubernetes universe. And so providing centralized policy management, for providing a centralized platform, it's become really critical. We see this over and over again. It's half of the challenge is simply, organizations kind of running into the enthusiastic adoption of Kubernetes, starting to look kind of like sprawl, not dissimilar from Amazon and VMware before it. We see adoption accelerate. We see teams themselves empowered to go out and deploy. And so we see a variety of implementations of security policy and often limited visibility into where this stuff is running. And
so you must be becoming a customer of these security technologies yourselves to invest in your own infrastructure.
We certainly partner really closely with them and work with them to ensure that they're really well implemented for our customer base. Because for our customers, they are definitely investing in Twistlock and Aqua and NuVector and the companies who are dedicated to trying to secure the runtime of the container, do the image scanning, do things like that. But it's, at the same time, we can't just kick that can to them. There's an enormous amount of work at the management layer that has to be done to secure this, to deal with just even using the functionality in Kubernetes. So, pod security policies are a pretty good example of this. It's been there now for for almost 2 years. You could define very strict policies about what can run, what kind of containers can be done, and yet, you talk to every customer we go into, it's probably only used by 5% of teams. And that's because it's much easier if you're just trying to get something out there to leave everything open. But if you want to implement really strong security on your Kubernetes environments, especially if you're doing any kind of multi-tenancy, or if your organization wants to imply some controls or implement some controls, they're phenomenal. I mean, it's a great way to do it. And so making that easier, one of the things we do at Rancher is we build all sorts of out-of-the-box pod security policies that you could quickly just pick from and then start to apply to namespaces, start to apply to different clusters. Same with roles, right? The RBAC in Kubernetes is fantastic. I can define any policies and allow you to do exactly specific things down to which APIs you can call. But defining that and then applying that to different policies, you can imagine the complexity you would get into trying to do that manually. It's like, building a house out of Legos. It's just too many tiny pieces run with too many people doing it. So, what Rancher does, you define a policy once and you apply that globally. That's been, as an open source project, I think that's helped a lot of people just take and get and consume the capabilities that are there, but do them once and not have to continuously implement them on different systems.
So you're focusing on the developer experience then to try to, I'm curious about that developer experience and how if you can increase that percentage of users who are actually taking advantage of these built-in capabilities that Kubernetes offers.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say it's the developer experience, Alex. I think I always sort of imagine, our job as a management platform is sort of dealing with two sides of the organization. On the one hand, we deal with the IT operations teams and the security teams, and they have kind of a global remit. They're trying to figure out, okay, what's our stance as a company to go after, kind of ensure that people can consume this technology and the developers have access to the tools they need, but do it in a way that meets our corporate governance responsibilities, make sure our customers' data is protected. So we actually would put this more towards, building tooling for the IT team, the IT operations team, the centralized teams that are trying to look out for the companies. There's a whole nother set of work that we do that I would gear more towards encouraging adoption and helping developers be more productive. And some of that is about making logging simpler, making monitoring simpler, doing things that make it easier to get Prometheus to all of these users, taking away the complexity of building Kubernetes, providing Kubernetes as a service. Like that all gets to putting it in more people's hands. And then even there, it doesn't really stop. I mean, there's an enormous amount of complexity right now as this cloud native ecosystem has exploded. We're continually putting people in the position where they've got to build their car, if that makes sense. Like there's a lot of tools out there, how to use Envoy, how to use Istio, how to use, cloud native storage services like Portworx. How do you figure out what to do with your school, your image scanning? How do you, what networking should you do? How do you use the new service meshes? What's the right answer for monitoring and logging? As a company focused on the platform and on the management experience, over time, we're trying to provide more integrated answers. So, every year Rancher does a little bit more. It adds more functionality, more capabilities, because, the bar for what we can deliver with a really clean, elegant user experience raises. And it's not that dissimilar. What we're trying to do, it doesn't feel that dissimilar from a cloud provider in that sense. You think about Amazon and Google and all of the services they have to provide. They have to do it in a way that is consistent. The user has access to everything consistently. Monitoring is done consistently. Logging is done, whether you're jumping between Fargate and EC2. That's the challenge we have to solve as a management play, as a product that does. And doing that open source means we also can't really define exactly how people do all these things. We have to be reasonably flexible. Some people are going to want to use Prometheus. Other people are going to want to use Datadog and Sysdig that are hosted services that do similar types of things. So providing an integrated solution with Prometheus is something we've been really working on a lot, and yet, we still want to make it super easy for people to use Sysdig, which we use ourselves and think is a fantastic way to do monitoring. So that's kind of that's the way we're sort of thinking about the developer side of what we do. It's about simplifying the onboarding process, giving more people access to a really clean, fully implemented car that they can just drive and don't have to necessarily build from the ground up.
You don't want to build a car from the ground up.
I'm sure people do. I'm sure there's, passion projects, but if you're trying to move quickly, it's probably not the best option. Certainly not if you're 16 and it's your first car.
It's opening up kind of a new realm of technologies, isn't it? Because the complexity now is changing quite a bit now that we're seeing the maturity of Kubernetes and thinking, and now that we're seeing this first vulnerability, it does create a kind of whole new level of complex, not just technologies that are being developed, but I think practices as well. I think kind of that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, I mean, it's like VMware. I think it's like Amazon. I do think Kubernetes is in that. It's the third stage of a progression we've been making about how to use software to basically replicate what we had as infrastructure, and it definitely is something that at its first, it starts with Docker. It starts with, wow, what can I do with a container? And now 3 containers on my machine, and look at how easily I can bring up a relatively complex piece, have really independent control of each layer there. But I don't need it on one machine. I need it on lots of machines. I need it to scale. I need it to interface with other things that exist in the universe. I now need to secure it. I need to have, all of these people working on it. It's not just me. It's a team that's going to be managing this server. You can just see, civilization developing, right? It's it's fantastic. And I think we're in a pace right now where the spiraling of innovation is causing more and more demand for tooling and for platforms like Rancher that make it take some of the complexity away while exposing the new kinds of complexity they're rolling in. So setting up Kubernetes isn't that hard anymore. I can get it in the cloud. I can get it on premise. One of the things Rancher did, that was really revolutionary when we rolled out 2.0 is we built something that managed any Kubernetes. We would implement it for you, but you could just take hosted Kubernetes from GKE, or you could bring one that John set up, for a demo lab. You can import any of these clusters or create any of these clusters and centralize policy and control access and set up security policies and all these things from one place. And that idea of a federated, multi-tenant, multi-cluster management plane that was open source, just that doesn't exist. And so in the last year since we announced it, and since in April when it went out, it's been incredible. I mean, we have 20,000 teams using it every day. There's just an enormous amount of adoption of this by teams of all sizes, because it really doesn't matter. As soon as you're past a single cluster, even if you just have a cluster, managing it and securing it and implementing it in a way that can be upgraded easily and can run across different infrastructures, it just makes life easy for the users. So we've seen, I think we've seen that the market accelerating has certainly increased the demand for integrations and implementing tooling that makes it easier to manage this stuff. Yeah.
And the tool ecosystem is really thriving now. It seems like kind of as a lot of these companies who we've been following for several years, like yourselves, are starting to really mature as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. I mean, it was definitely a year of consolidation, though. I mean, you look at this year.
Yeah.
I mean, many of the companies that we would see as ecosystem, partners or competitors even, have been acquired. I mean, from CoreOS, kind of towards, the beginning of the year, to Red Hat at the end of the year, to Heptio. I mean, there's a lot of people that are doing the build out, or trying to solve users' problems around infrastructure management and application management with containers that are now part of new companies. And so, I think that's going to open up some room in the market. So you'll see, I've talked to a few people who are starting new companies who are trying to do things. And so I expect a second wave of innovation as more companies get funded on the back of, how do we grow this? How do we take it from here where it's still probably quite even generously, we're probably talking about 3 to 5% of IT is running in containers, maybe less, right? There's a long way to go if this is actually going to be anywhere near as impactful as things like Amazon and VMware. 8,000 people here is not a bad start. I mean, we are seeing explosive growth. I'm on the board of the CNCF, the governing board, and I think the universal feeling is that Kubernetes is a huge hit, but Envoy is a huge hit, and Prometheus is a huge hit, and this ecosystem is generating really popular open source projects, that are gaining enormous traction. Containerd, and I expect that the CNCF is going to continue to recruit really good projects because of, both what the Linux Foundation provides in terms of frameworks and independence, but also this idea is a really good one. The idea that there's a place where, open source technologies can come, be evaluated, go through a process of exposure to the market, and as they grow, gain adoption, gain awareness. And so I'm incredibly proud of the work that the CNCF and the team at the Linux Foundation has done this year to not, to kind of go beyond just Kubernetes. You saw the graduation of Prometheus was a big deal, but its adoption is the big deal. The big deal is everyone's using Envoy. Envoy is a huge win. It's a huge success. And I think there's going to be, I just am really excited about where the foundation is going as well.
Well, Shannon, thank you for taking some time to talk today about the security issues and the community and going forward. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. Always fun to be here.
This episode of the New Stack Makers is brought to you by Twistlock, the complete cloud-native security platform protecting containers, serverless, and Kubernetes applications against threats. Twistlock is the only cloud-native security platform to provide real-time threat intelligence and management through the application development lifecycle across every cloud-native environment. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes
like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.